Hello, my name is Ross Baldick. I'm a professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. I'd like to introduce my class, Restructured Electricity Markets, Locational Marginal Pricing. This class focuses on the markets in place in North America, in particular Eastern United States, Midwest United States, California, and most recently in my own state of Texas, in the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. I'm going to use ERCOT as my main example, but I'll also introduce features of other North American markets, such as capacity markets, when they are different to the setup in ERCOT. We'll look at how to solve power flow, how to think about optimal dispatch, how to think about offer-based economic dispatch, and then the implications of transmission and unit commitment. A key issue will be pricing and the incentives of price due to prices in markets. And we'll particularly focus on this when we're looking at transmission limits. I'm first going to introduce electricity markets, or so-called organized electricity markets, ignoring transmission constraints. The reason why I do that is because I think it's easier to understand the overall framework first without transmission constraints. And then we'll introduce transmission constraints and their implications. We'll also see quite a number of other topics. For example, how to hedge risk. This course covers technical topics in power systems, in optimization, and in economics, and it does so at a graduate level. We'll do a mathematically rigorous presentation. One issue that I find in teaching such a class is that very few students have background in all three areas. My suggestion is that before tackling this class, you should have an undergraduate technical background in at least two of these areas. For any area that you don't have a strong background, you should expect to read a little bit outside of the class. The first third of the semester will review this background material, but it will be a review aimed at students who've already seen it before. All of my slides for this class are available for downloading at the website shown on the screen. To introduce restructuring of electricity markets, I start with a history of electricity restructuring in Texas. If you're from another region, you might want to look at the history from your own region rather than looking at Texas. Then I move on to the background material. There are three areas of background material, as I mentioned: power systems, optimization, and economics. Each of them are divided into a pair of topics. The first pair is simultaneous equations and power flow itself. We'll start off with how to solve nonlinear simultaneous equations. As it happens, most formulations, and the formulations we'll study of markets, tend to linearize or use a linearized version. Nevertheless, it's important to understand how the nonlinear models are solved, but also the linearization itself is clearest if understood in the context of solving the original nonlinear problem. So after we've studied simultaneous equations, we'll then look at power flow itself. We'll see how linearization works, drawing from the material on simultaneous equations. We will then derive the DC power flow, which is the most common model underlying day-ahead markets. Linearized power flow underlies typical real-time markets, and we will be looking at that too. The second area is on optimization and economic dispatch. We'll first look at optimization problems. When we're thinking about dispatch, the context is variables that are continuous, decision variables that are continuous. And we'll look first at unconstrained problems, equality constrained problems, and then inequality constrained problems. In the later parts of the semester, we'll also need to think about unit commitment, so we'll discuss integer problems as well. Then we'll cover economic dispatch, optimality conditions, examples, and how to solve it using linear programming. The third area is on economics. I'll start with some discussion of microeconomics, which will include some discussion of the various phrases and words that economists use that may be a little unfamiliar to engineers. We'll draw on an example, not from electricity, but one that helps us to understand the implications for electricity. We'll look at both short-term and longer-term issues and discuss implications of demand. Then we'll turn to economic decision-making in the specific context of electricity. We'll look at the short term, which means how do we operate the system, and we'll also look at the long term. How do we understand the planning of investment in new generation? We'll compare central planning to markets. We'll think about how we should set up markets, and we will understand the various idealizations that make a market work ideally. We'll see how they relate, or in some cases don't perfectly relate, to competition in practice in electricity. And we'll discuss a few other topics such as bilateral contracts. As well as that background material, I will also be drawing from and using the PowerWorld simulator. You should download and install PowerWorld and look at the tutorial on how to use PowerWorld. We'll occasionally use a couple of test systems. After we've covered that background material, which takes about a third to a half of the semester, we'll spend the rest of the semester covering the meat of the course. First, offer-based economic dispatch. As I mentioned, first ignoring transmission constraints. We'll draw from our definitions in economics, surplus, for example, to understand the motivations for setting up offer-based economic dispatch. We'll see how supply-demand balance and generator constraints come together to provide a feasible set for our dispatch decisions. We'll discuss the need for centralized coordination, that is to say, the need for a system operator. We'll formulate the problem of economic dispatch as an optimization problem, drawing from our previous formulation, and extend it to offer-based economic dispatch, where we need generation offers and some demand-side specification or bids. We'll discuss pricing and the incentives from pricing, and how those prices provide incentives for dispatch that's consistent with economic dispatch. When we don't have enough generation to meet demand, we need to consider the implications. We'll look at that in the context of value of lost load and the implications for pricing and incentives for new generation. Then we'll study some generalizations, including ancillary services such as reserves and regulation. Then we will represent the transmission system. We'll consider optimal power flow, the counterpart of economic dispatch, when we have transmission constraints. We'll approximate full optimal power flow with DC optimal power flow, and then examine the version of it that operates in electricity markets. We could call it offer-based optimal power flow. We'll see some examples, the properties of the prices, namely locational marginal prices that fall out of the offer-based optimal power flow formulation, and then define a few concepts such as congestion rent and congestion cost. We'll see what happens when we want to represent contingency constraints, and we'll consider reactive power and losses. We'll spend a little time understanding decomposition and linearization. Then we'll turn to unit commitment. Unit commitment considers a time horizon, a day, let's say, and we'll look at temporal issues that generalize the snapshot focus of the previous sections of work. We'll formulate the unit commitment problem, look at one technique to solve it, or to approximately solve it, called Lagrangian relaxation. We'll see the problems that come out of it associated with the duality gap. We'll then look at a more modern approach to solving unit commitment using mixed integer programming. We'll see from the duality gaps in Lagrangian relaxation and the solution for mixed integer programming, how we can set up prices that will encourage generators to commit and dispatch consistent with our unit commitment decisions. That will involve make-whole payments. That will mean we'll have side payments that are not anonymous in the way that energy prices are anonymous. We'll see some implications for investment decisions. Then we'll introduce transmission constraints. Finally, we'll look at a few more topics such as day-ahead and real-time markets, the representation of reserves, and how we consider the case when we can't meet all of the reserve constraints. The final topic is an introduction to hedging of energy and transmission price risk. We'll look at volatility of energy prices, forward markets to hedge that volatility, contracts for differences, how that has implications for capital formation and generation adequacy. The counterpart of volatility of energy prices is the volatility of transmission prices, and we'll investigate that issue and financial instruments to hedge against that volatility called financial transmission rights. Finally, we'll look at revenue adequacy. All of the materials, all of my slides are available on my University of Texas website. You can see the link in the middle of the page. To summarize, this course covers power systems, optimization, and economics in a rigorous fashion. At the end of the semester-long course, I hope that you'll be able to understand locational marginal pricing at a very deep level.